Today, we're sitting down with Eddie Davis, a sales and marketing expert who spent over 20 years helping businesses grow. He's the founder of Sales Funnel Professor, a go-to-market strategist, and an advisor to high-growth SaaS and fintech companies. From optimizing sales to advising top-tier startups, Eddie knows what works. And today, we're breaking down sales, UX, and how AI is shaping the future of business. Let's get into it. Hey Eddie, how's it going?
Hey, Andre, doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for being here. So, Eddie, I have a question I'm dying to make, which is you had this very vast and diverse career, right? One constant throughout has been sales and marketing. Where exactly would you draw the line between sales and marketing?
This is a tough question because there are so many loose definitions in this space, but I think of it in terms of sort of conceptually and then also in terms of roles, right? So is it a marketing role or is it a sales role? So I think marketing is broader. Marketing ultimately is about, here's a company, they can do all of these things. Which of those things should they be doing? So that, can be product market fit. How can we do the best thing that's going to be the best for us, right? So there's a research component to that. Sales in a funnel is generally middle to bottom of the funnel, right? That's where a human steps in and maybe is educating and helping actually close business, right? So a great salesperson, so to speak, is often synonymous with a closer. Um, so, but there are plenty of funnels that you guys work on where there isn't really a closer or a human who's representing the company. It's just to sign up in a great product, self-service, and the app or the experience basically collects the money and off you go, right? So in B2C, that's much more common, but in B2B, that's becoming more common too. So I would say marketing is a broader concept. If we're talking about roles, marketing would be stranger to middle of funnel and sales would be middle to close. But if we're talking about sort of, you know, what is it conceptually, I think marketing has that research component, whereas sales is much more about, I already know what it is. I want to, expand on your understanding and help you make.
Mhm. You mentioned the funnel there. That's as a product manager and a project manager before, never really involved too much in sales. I've recently began hearing a lot of the sales funnel, right? And I mean, you're certainly an expert at that. Uh, the question I always have is the funnel like a human thing? Is it a constant representation of what like what selling or even purchasing kind of is for humanity? Like, would a sales funnel apply to like other ages, or is it like this modern concept?
I think it does apply. So, I mean, fundamentally, if you oversimplify it, it's strangers, right? Taking interest in something, and eventually some of them will buy it, but not all of them, right? So that's why a funnel narrows, right? So that's the simplest piece of it. So I think that's always been the case. There have always been, even in bartering times, trading shells for donkeys or whatever, there may have been purchases that were desired, but they didn't actually happen at the end of the day. So I think it is sort of universally applicable just because one party or the other wants a transaction to happen, but if they don't happen, then in essence the funnel narrows basically.
Makes a lot of sense, and then essentially all the strategies involved in that, right? Eddie, I know you spent a time in Costa Rica, right, during your career,
I
and
did,
then
yeah, about
yep.
8 years, yeah.
Oh, that's a long time, yeah. And then you switched to Atlanta, which is the fintech capital of the world, right? How was that? Like, what do you how do you compare these two experiences?
So I was born in Atlanta and then I left. So when I came back, I was, my friends would joke I'd miss certain cultural things. They would be
Mm,
talking about, TV shows, and it just would have totally not been on my radar. So there was a cultural gap for sure. But I think from a business perspective, it's Costa Rica and other places, are getting more merged into the global economy. Now Costa Rica has a digital nomads visa, as does Portugal and many other countries, right? In that era, they were trying to prevent that sort of thing. But for me in particular, the technology gap. So I went to university in Atlanta. We had a T3, blazing fast internet connection. And then where I lived in Costa Rica was actually at the beach. And there was one electricity pole, continuous chain that also carried the telephone line. And that was, it was literally dial-up modem in 2003, 2004. And if a truck hit any of those poles for 50 miles, there's no power, there's no internet, the bank is closed, and you're in the dark at night. So, I think you get more resilient, right? You get used to, or you anticipate disruption. So I think that's definitely part of doing business in places like that. But I think now the world is becoming more connected, right? One of my dear friends, was working for a big corporation. Her boss at this multinational lives in San Jose, Costa Rica. So I think it's coming together. But in that era, it was very much it's kind of like being at the end of the earth, frankly, and some of those adventures, and weather and and earthquakes and all that good stuff. But an incredible amount of fun. It would be tough to be as super focused and do internet-based businesses that always have to be up in that era in Costa Rica, but that's becoming more and more possible for sure.
Makes sense. I guess that's happening all over the world, right? We're all getting more connected, and the markets are changing. I mean, when we look at the era we're in right now, it's hardly even comparable to, like, I don't know, 2005, 2006. And I have a hot question for you in that sense, especially regarding sales and marketing in the modern world. So we have a lot of, I mean, the digital market is pretty much a thing of its own now. We have like digital ads and all of that stuff. And sometimes there's kind of this bad reputation in a sense that it's like perhaps too much in people's faces, or I know, perhaps even intrusive, a bit manipulative, How do you think like businesses can use the tools that we have now uh, effectively in a way that they're not going to like jeopardize the perception of their audience, kind of like lose their trust?
So, yeah, to kind of expand on that, generally when people make those comments, they're talking about cookie-based advertising, right? So, or there are products that are really good at, segmenting based on your internet behavior. They're pulling together lots of data sets to kind of understand who you are and serve hyper targeted ads, right? So that's generally when people make these comments, that's what they're talking about, right? And so where did those cookies get set? Europe has taken the stance that you need to opt into that. So that's sort of, part of GDPR. Other countries don't do that. And I think it really depends on sort of what your overall understanding of the internet is. Um, I think sometimes people take it more seriously or try to apply rules that, are the same as if we were, physically present, and that's challenging. So, on the one hand, I think there are plenty of products where just by the nature of the product, or, let's say you're a divorce attorney, right? Should you be serving retargeting ads that say, I'm a divorce attorney, and, the husband or the wife is reading, I don't know, some sports, right? And there are divorce attorney ads all over the place at their house. That's probably crossing a line. But I think what, people are, more sort of the gray area, right, is, I was looking at something, I wanted it, I may not have explicitly said, serve me those ads. And so some people get bothered by that. Um, I tend to take sort of a, more of a humorous, reaction to it sometimes, because we run those ads. So some people would say it's negative, it's intrusive, it's also really convenient, right? So the alternative would be, I'm blasted by whoever has the most money, and it's irrelevant to me. From the perspective of companies that really couldn't make any money, like think about newspapers, right? Traditional newspapers can't make money anymore, hardly, right? I mean, they're all failing and getting bought up and all that sort of stuff. So imagine they're making their money off of basically those ads, paying them for the real estate. If they have to serve ads that I'm never going to click, they're just going to fail, right? So would I rather look, if I have to look at ads, I'd certainly rather look at ads that are relevant. So that's a convenience factor. You and I were talking at the beginning of the call too about, being really busy and entrepreneurial and that sort of thing. I have two kids. I'm looking at different things. I'm doing a million things. Sometimes I need to, I'm on one track, I get distracted and I get a retargeting ad, and I'm just like, oh, thank goodness they're retargeting, because I'd forgotten about this, but I need to get this done. So there is a convenience piece. Um, but I think it really just comes down to sort of how we really culturally have very different interpretations of what the internet is and who it belongs to and that sort of thing. But I would just say for people that are, get really stressed out about it, just take a step back. It's, it's this sort of cross national, semi regulated, semi not world, and don't take it so seriously, and some of those ads can be really hilarious too. Like when I had my daughter, I started getting served adult diaper ads. So there was a little bit of a crosswire in what we were searching. So anyway, I don't know. I would tend to just, I'm kind of chill about that stuff. And I think overall it's probably okay, but I can appreciate that we may be moving to a world, Meta, for example, now you can pay them. Basically, they got to make money somehow, right? So you can pay them to not be served ads. And we may see more and more of that sort of environment by environment where you either pay the premium, and it's like, it's like connected TV, right? You can pay for, you know, free movies, in which case you're going to get ads. You're not paying, right? The ads are paying for you, or you actually just pay a subscription and you don't get ads. So I suspect we're kind of moving in that direction across more properties eventually.
Hmm. Interesting. You know what? From a UX point of view, I tend to see these ads, for instance, as, I mean, we're all purchasers, right? That's the part that I think some people might forget a bit. Like we need to buy stuff, we need to purchase things,
Right.
and isn't it so much easy when you actually see things that you're looking for that make sense to you, that fit your needs, right? So I'm one for to always opt in. Like I like good ads. I want ads based on what I like, on what I'm usually searching for. If I'm searching for fishing stuff, it makes total sense that I'm gonna see fishing stuff, right? That's what I'm
Yeah.
probably looking to purchase. And in UX, I think it could even be seen as a UX problem. Like if you're getting bad ads, if the research is wrong, you're getting targeted wrong, that is probably the main problem, right? Not the fact that you're getting ads. That's usually my take on it.
Yeah, I think your take is right. I mean, and we're moving to a world where any product experience can be, if the person providing that experience wants to, experiences can be more and more customized to you, which a lot of people do like, right? They don't want the generic experience. So yeah, I think it can be positive for sure.
Eddie, on a side note, regarding sales and marketing, how how much of it is research? I would imagine like nowadays a big chunk of it is research related, like understanding the audience. But like how proportionate would that be to the other aspects of marketing? And
So I think there's something interesting. I know, we both do at least some work for startups, right? And startups are pretty interesting, right? And disruption and, breaking new ground and creative destruction, all those things, right? So for me, research that I always do, right, is I try to understand, if I didn't know the name of this, but I can put a category name on this, does that exist in the market? Do people know what that is? So imagining, I think we all know what a CRM is at this point, right? Oracle has been around forever. Salesforce came, then HubSpot, et cetera, right? And we have all these other downstream versions of that, right? But there are new types of software as a service that come into existence all the time. So the question would be, you know, if I were to, does this software even have a category? It can be a great thing if it is your category, because you're the first, that can be nice. But at the same time, if the market doesn't know, they don't know your name, they don't know that this category exists, then that's going to be a challenge, right, on the marketing side, because it means you're going to have to educate the the world about it, right? And that's expensive. So that type of research, I think, is a big one. Once you do that research, for me, it kind of ends up being, if there's knowledge, then it becomes often, on an inbound basis. Can I capture, and using ads, for example, targeted ads, or using organic search or social media, right? Can I talk to the right people and they come to me, right? Because I can buy that or rank for that phrase or whatever, right? Some sort of, XYZ software, right? If people are searching that by the hundreds, okay, great. There's an inbound funnel to be had. But the opposite would be, if the world doesn't know, right, then you have to go out and say, this is my ideal customer profile, right? I want these executives at companies in these industries, because if they use my tool, life would be better in this way. But if those executives don't know to even think about that, you have to go find them, right? So that becomes an outbound scenario, right? So that type of research for sure, I think is interesting. Um, also just general digital competitiveness, right? In the United States, we have a lot of litigation. So if you are a plaintiff's attorney, you want to attract people that were in car wrecks, that is wildly expensive and wildly competitive. If you are an e-commerce company that sells commodity services, that is very expensive as well and very stats based, right? But there are tons of industries where the digital landscape isn't competitive, right? So based on how those things look, it really, from a marketing perspective and sales, it really, those things inform the strategy that makes the most sense, right? And how you can get ROI and whether you can get ROI as a day one startup and all that sort of stuff.
It's interesting, and we've kind of started talking a bit about UX there. Uh, you're of course a master of marketing and sales, but I know for a fact that you're also very interested and you value UX a lot, right?
I do.
What's your take, like, on user experience? How do you see it?
So I think that, you know, I always try to encourage, clients or people that work for me or that I'm teaching. There's tactical and granular work, but we also need to very much zoom out. The 10,000-foot view, right, is a term in English, right? It's a good one, right? So zooming out, if we said in marketing, in sales, the most simple way to be successful is if I'm the vendor, I need to show the potential customer that I care. I care about them. I care about what I do. I care about delivering what I say I will, all of those things. Show me you care. So imagining the marketing is on point. It resonates emotionally. I got that person interested. Maybe there's a salesperson, right? They're great. They take a personal interest, right? They spend all the time with that person. They talk to secondary decision makers, right? They're educating them. They're not, pressuring them. They're not manipulative, right? They're showing they care, right? Okay, great. A lot of those experiences could be a car, right? Could be software in your case, right? There's a handoff post purchase. And then sometimes there's a free trial, in which case there may be a salesperson or there may not, or there may be a support person involved or there may not. But there's a continuity of, right, okay, now I'm in this tool. And how was that tool constructed? And I think we're so many generations into cloud software, right, that innately, and I'm technically barely millennial, we have Gen Z as well, but internet native decision makers are all over the place, right? And they're the people that are buying software these days, right? So we can feel it in the UX, right? The second you get in a product, I'll look at it and go, this is two generations level design, right? This looks old. If I want to be condescending, I would say this looks like Prodigy, right? This looks like pre AOL, right? And that there is some of that out there, right? There's not a lot, but there's still some of that around, right? And so some of the struggle with UX is really just the question is, you end up with cognitive dissonance, right? Or distress. The marketing was great. The salesperson seems awesome. But then I get into the actual tool and I'm like, did they put any money into design? Is there no QA team here? Is this reliable? Can I trust it? Can I figure it out? Am I going to have to pay for support because it's so idiosyncratic in the way it's designed? So, I mean, UX and software to me is just an extension of the whole sales funnel in many cases. It may be post close, like, okay, we got the money because it's an annual contract, but so what if that person's not going to renew, right? In many cases, that's going to be even worse because you got their money. If you don't give it back, they're going to body slam you on review sites and going to make it even harder, right? So ideally, you have continuity between marketing, whatever the sales function is, and then the actual experience of the product and software. And I mean, we can feel it, right? As I mean, you're a connoisseur. It's the same thing as people that have a palate or foodies or wine or whatever. If you use a bunch of software, you can feel it immediately, right? Is this quality? Is it well thought out? Do these people, think it through? Do they do adequate testing, or is it just, thrown together kind of, you know, you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the threshold is, I mean, it seems like the market is getting more and more demanding in regards to UX, right? For instance, and I think it has to do with the generations, perhaps. Some generations, for instance, I've started using Windows XP, I think. That was a time when you had to know how to do stuff, right? It wasn't that easy. There was the UX just wasn't there. You had to think through, you had to read to get access to specific parts of what your product was. Nowadays, no. Like we're designing software in a way that we're literally trying to make it easy for users not even have to think, right? And I think that that level of quality tends to make the marketing more demanding, doesn't it? What's your take on this change? Have you noticed this change in the companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. So we do a lot of work with banks and credit unions in the United States, and there are tons of them. So, and a lot of what they do, unfortunately, is tied to the Fed, right? So, there is an interest rate, and banks basically loan slightly above that. And there are a lot of ubiquitous products from one bank to another. And, they credit unions are, fundamentally it's places where you can park your money and use checks and cards and things of that nature. And those cards and that software often are licensed, right? So, when you don't have control, a challenge in that industry, and there is a lot of consolidation in the US banking industry because we have a generational shift, right? It was baby boomers, they're aging out, right? They're no longer running businesses, or there's some, but they will eventually all retire and all that sort of stuff. We have, Gen X and millennials, and shortly Gen Z are becoming more and more, and they want, like you described, they want a B2C app experience. They want a Cash App experience, right? They want a Facebook experience. They want intuitive, right? But banks and credit unions are often, they don't run their own software. They're running, white labeled software, right? So it's on their partners to catch up. So yeah, I mean, that is a real reason for attrition. And, fundamentally, people talk, Jack Dorsey doesn't get as much press lately, but for a minute, during COVID, Square was, going like gangbusters. They are technically a bank, but fundamentally Square, has a big market cap because the way they acquire people with Cash App, it's basically viral, and it's what you described. It's super intuitive, right? So that, I mean, that is an example, but yeah, I mean, I think that companies that don't have UX experts, and like you said, I mean, specifically that understand, there are certain UX models that are known now, right? I mean, right top, drop down, that's often where user settings are now, right? Your key navigational elements now mostly are in left nav. They used to be in top nav. But yeah, I mean, you can
Hmm.
say we're going to follow the pattern that people know and make it super intuitive, or we can innovate. But I've seen a lot of people that think they're being innovative, and really they're just causing a lot of friction, right? It's not. There are places to innovate, and there are places to just follow the patterns, if you know what I mean. And a lot of teams don't have access to somebody who really has that sort of refined knowledge of, you know, what are things supposed to look like, right? And what's out of pattern, right? A lot of it's just out of pattern. Is this out of pattern? I have to think. I don't want to think. I don't like this. I'm having to think. I don't want to think about this,
Yep.
But yeah, absolutely. The bar is way higher
Yep.
for sure.
That is a constant balance, which you mentioned there in the UX side of, do we innovate here or do we follow the
Yep.
pattern, right? And it is a fine balance because we're constantly dealing with new challenges, like new UX challenges. We have companies that are doing things that I don't think the market, or I don't think there's a familiarity aspect attached to certain aspects of that product yet. So then we have to say, can we connect that to an existing experience? For instance, you've mentioned, okay, left navigation, that's something we know, but there's a constraint here. Now, what do we do with that constraint? How do we work on it? It's this fine balancing, right, of new slash familiar. And many people get it wrong. They try to reinvent the wheel at every turn, or they simply, well, never do. Yeah.
No, yeah, I think that's it. And we live in an awesome time for that too, because I don't know that there is a, you know, AR, VR, defined UX pattern yet, right? And we are at a place, QWERTY keyboards are 100, almost 150 years old at this point, right? It's a very inefficient way to, to communicate, right? So I think we're about to have a paradigm shift. We're not quite there yet, but there will be some new patterns and we don't know what they are. So I think, yeah, there's places to follow and places where there's a lot of white space because nobody's really locked it down yet.
So, Eddie, you've mentioned VR. We actually had a team here in Esfera working in VR, and it's exactly like you described. There's no familiarity aspects to it still. So, users, we don't have this pattern to follow. We're mostly in uncharted territory, and it's really hard, but also it's really where we get to shine, right? Where the current UX designers, it's the market we can now excel in because we can create the things that are going to become the next standard, right? It's like a gold rush in a sense. What's your take on VR? Have you worked with it?
I've followed it for quite a while, VR and AR, right? So the original Google Glass, I was in a startup, we had access to it. It was pretty limited. I remember the glass holes era and that whole thing. I'm an investor in Unity. I've always tracked, video game technology and always wondering, where will that sort of experience come into more work based. Today, I'm part of a company that does VR and AR based learning, and I think it's pretty fascinating, right? So, I mean, COVID was very interesting for us because we went from, 10,000 square foot office to remote world, right? So everybody's disconnected anyway. So I think Zuckerberg gets a lot of grief for Meta not really doing Meta very well. The metaverse, his version was not a hit to say the least. But Ready Player One and things like that. I mean, I think the tech will catch up with those sorts of things. Um, but I think it's, the gaming part of it, I think is, will continue to evolve in its own sort of direction. But where I really see it coming into play is as a learning tool and as an efficiency tool. Yeah, I mean, I want somebody to do it. I mean, just on this conversation, I would imagine you do this too. I At my home office, I have 3 monitors. I have the one I'm talking to you on, I have one over here, and I have one over here, right? When the glasses and the resolution and the speed is there, I could have, you know, essentially a sphere of information around me. So hopefully eventually we'll get there. But yeah, I think it's fascinating, and I think there are some big companies. I'm not sure that the current players, are going to be the ones that maybe some folks that we've never heard of. But when you can take a backbone like Unity or a competitor of theirs and sort of get creative with it, I think there's going to be some remarkable stuff, and I think we'll see a lot of efficiency gains with that. I mean, there's more to it than that, right? AI is coming in at the same time, but we may be moving, like I said, moving away from key-based computing for the most part to much more sort of spatial computing and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's pretty awesome.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm eager to see. Actually, I hadn't even think too much about the, let's say, the crossing of AI and AR or VR yet. But I think that is certainly the future. I mean, of course, it's easy to go wrong in things like that, predicting the future, right? But it certainly seems like the path we're about to go down. And yeah, we'll continue with the challenges UX wise. I love uncharted territories. I believe a lot of designers like that opportunity to, like, hey, maybe we're the pioneers here. We're having the chance to not just follow patterns, but like we can create something here and we can make a mark not just for ourselves but for users. Like, hey, this is so good. Hearing that as a designer on something you created is it's a rush, right? Eddie, talking about experiences with UX, you've mentioned banks, and honestly, I think that's a worldwide international experience that banks generally are lacking in UX. Uh, what would be like? Do you have a practical scenario where you've seen like super bad UX lead to either drop in sales or revenue losses? Any like direct scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. One that comes to mind is, I was parallel to a team that was working on a loan application. So it's basically formware, right? So
Hmm.
imagining that if I'm filling out this form, I think I might get money. That's pretty attractive, right? But it's a multi-step form, and we put in some analytics on this form, and the number that came back for completion was 1%. So that's pretty
Oh,
rough. So and that's, I mean, I with startups, you have to start somewhere, right? So getting UX out there, and I mean, that's just an example, but we do, when I work with SaaS companies, it seems like this would be more widely known, but a lot of companies don't use sort of a DVR type software, right? They don't use a full story or a hotjar or something that records actual sessions, right? And I think that I'm guilty of this too when I'm sort of brainstorming software. When I come up with, you know, login screens or sign up flows, right? To me, it's very intuitive. Somebody should flow through it, right? But when you actually watch real users, it's remarkable how many pass and how many things can happen that you never thought about, right? So I've seen, I mean, just even over and over and over again with just sign up flows, right? I've seen those on so many products where there are issues with just sign up flows, right? You would think every product has a sign up flow, right? That it would just be done easy, but remarkably, it isn't, right? I think you and I have even worked on some of that, right?
oh yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think those are more. I think that people don't. There's a general disconnect about how difficult great UX is, right? And how, people just think it's like so simple to do it great. And I just have never found that to be the case. I think that there are it is a very uh intense, and I mean, it is a very special type of expertise to do it really well very quickly the first time. Let's put it that way.
That makes sense. I mean, login, setup screen, signing, those are, that's again, tracing back to that balance I said. These are some of the screens that I think are the hardest to actually reinvent or to bring something new, because they're so omnipresent, right? And we're so familiarized with the idea of signing into a product, signing into a platform. There's not a lot you can do to variate that without causing immediate friction to the user. And why would you want to cause immediate friction right at the beginning of their journey with your product? You have to have some kind of reward for that, for inventing something that has to outweigh
Yep.
that attrition. And that's the thing. Currently, I think the technology simply offers no like better alternative than what we currently have. So I think that's exactly why we keep seeing good old same login screens. That brings us to an interesting question. In your vision, do you think a particular product, or let's say a particular screen of a product, do you think it can reach perfection or something similar to it? Can it reach like the most advanced state it can have for its users?
That's a great question. I would tend to think that I don't know that there's, because people are different, right? I mean, that is a challenge, right? So there's always like we were discussing earlier, right? If we layer in customization, then there are perfect is different for everybody, right? But I mean, if we're talking about, can we arrive at a screen that does one thing that mathematically does the best job of, based on testing, statistically serves the broadest audience correctly the first time, sort of a thing? I think we probably, are sort of moving in that direction. When we look at connected TV apps, for example, they all sort of more or less have evolved into a side scrolling of categories type UX and that sort of thing. And I think that works fine for our current, world. When we move into an AR or VR or, world, then that will be wide open again, and people won't even necessarily, I mean, I don't think we'll be leveraging screens like monitors and TVs all that much longer in the first place, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that it will open up again. But yeah, I mean, I think the business case is really, is there a point in trying to spending money on a particular screen to try to get it even better than what it is? I think there's, good enough is good enough kind of a thing. And there's more value in other places to, invest. Let's put it that way. So I would say there's sort of a terminal state, I guess, if that makes sense.
Interesting. And it's a interesting take that this terminal point is very connected to the value, right? Like, how much do we spend now to try and make it even better and even better if it's doing its job, right? Users are okay with it. It's a great experience. Let's move on to the parts that are not great, right? So this is a great take. Many times in UX, and I think in design in general, if we study just the theory of it, we lose track a bit with business decisions, right? That make a lot of sense. For instance, like, how much do we put into a specific? Ideally, if you let me, I am going to probably try and go with a screen until I reach perfection, right?
Yep.
If they keep paying me for it, I'm going to love to try and take the best out of that screen, make sure users absolutely love it, even if it's a random configuration screen, right? But there's a threshold where that certainly has no more benefits. Like, everyone's happy with it. And I see that a lot in how some big companies that invest well in UX. It's hard not to mention, for instance, Apple, right? It's such a they have such a dedication for user experience, and to me, it's an incredible case of how you can find good UX even in the deepest of pages where users are going to be passing 0.1% of the usage time. You go there and you say, "Wow, someone really thought out everything in this." So there's this economic aspect to it, doesn't it?
There is, but I think there's also a key point that a lot of companies miss, which is, based on Figma is a great tool, for example, right? Or Adobe products or whatever, whatever you want to use for those sorts of things, right? And then when you go develop something, there are a lot of companies, and I see them all the time, that don't have an overarching design approach, right? So screen by screen, it doesn't feel the same, right? But I think where, Apple has done a great job, and I mean, Steve Jobs borrowed that from Xerox and the way back and all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, a lot of great UX, there is a pattern across the whole thing, and people are looking at, and like in my world, it's is this on brand or off brand? If it's off brand, that causes problems. If it's UX, it has to be on brand too, but it also needs to be
Mhm.
on pattern, so to speak, right? So that this screen doesn't feel like a different app, right? So that's, but yeah, Apple does an amazing job of keeping things very cohesive. Absolutely. And they have very high standards.
Yep. Consistency is indeed key. I think that's a good connection between marketing and UX. You have to keep it consistent, right? Same idea. So, a lot about the psychological aspects, kind of understanding human behaviors and trying to make and give the best to humans based on their behaviors, right? Eddie, we've briefly started talking a little bit about AI. Uh, if I may expand it a bit and be very broad now and just get like, what's your opinion on AI? What's your general take on it?
Um, I started writing about AI about 10 years ago, maybe 12. And, a major concern then, as it is today, is AI going to wipe out jobs? And the question is undoubtedly it will. And the bigger concern is, will it bring forth other types of jobs, right? So that aspect of it, I think it is concerning, right? I mean, I don't see, it's sort of like, I don't think we need more Instagram influencers. I think that's pretty saturated, right? If the AI trainer, right? I'm just not sure how many people can be the AI instructor, right? I don't know that that's a job that we need millions and millions of. So I think on that side, it is a little bit concerning. I think we're moving in a different direction, right? But I think we've got some other technology that's coming into play. I don't know if you're following nuclear fusion, for example, but a lot of challenges, right, are based around energy rights and that sort of stuff. So, are we moving to a world where maybe eventually we won't be so capitalist? I don't know. But what I think is really interesting and pretty amazing in the short term, and I think we were talking about it earlier, right, is with AI, with no code, low code, with certain tools that are really more like platforms at this point, right? It used to be that a great software developer, right, was very much like a Steve Wozniak, right? I mean, he was a coder who also understood the intersection between code and hardware, and we're well beyond that, right? The
Mhm.
generation of what's coming online today, it's much more like Steve Jobs, right? He didn't see, this is just parts, right? His innovation was really about combining things, right? It's Gorilla Glass plus a Apple type thing, right? It's this plus that, right, equals this. And so these combination products, right? We're in this amazing world where micro businesses that can create super bespoke solutions are possible, right? So AI helps a ton with that, right? So somebody that, I used to work out of an accelerator where the investors there said, they just made no bones about it. We will not invest in a company that doesn't have a technical founder, like a coder, a software engineer. We just won't do it. We don't do it here, right? We're moving into a place where coding is almost becoming, and QA and other things like that. It's always been a commodity to a certain extent, but it was a well-paid commodity, right? So we're moving more and more into the direction of, people that are creative. That's the true differentiator, right? Because if you're creative enough and you're empathetic enough, you can come up with your own products, combining these pieces with AI, filling in gaps or doing your content or that sort of thing. So I think we're moving into a world where we're maybe going to see a lot less sort of monolithic Facebooks and Googles and huge mega cap. Not that there won't ever, that's going away, but I think we'll see a lot more micro, small employee count, technology driven plays like a Basecamp or the early days of Mailchimp. Like I think that is so much more achievable because the tools that connect thought to functional computer code, screens, and that sort of stuff. I think we're moving that accelerating. So from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think it's really exciting. I think we're going to have a lot more products, and we're already seeing this. I mean, I don't know about you, but I see a new bespoke industry specific CRM. There are probably 5,000 of those now. I mean, it's remarkable, right? And there are all these people doing certain things on top of AI. So I think we'll see more and more of that. So I have mixed feelings about it, right? From a pure sales perspective, I have some concerns about how does somebody break into, if you wanted a career in sales, right? It's sort of the SDR piece, right? I think the SDR sort of prospecting, it used to be you would use junior people because it was, labor intensive, right? But it's also how they got familiar with talking with strangers, and they built up some toughness about rejection and that sort of thing, right? So with those roles going away, an open question, a lot of senior sales executives that I know, we have that same question, how do you sort of bridge that gap to be a senior sales executive when there's no middle ground, right? So, it
Mhm.
is changing things for sure. But overall, I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I think it facilitates creativity in a really special way. So it definitely favors folks that are sort of, have that innately, if that makes sense.
Interesting. I've this reminded me of I think it was vice president of product for Figma.
Okay.
Figma recently updated, and it's now integrating a lot of AI tools
Hmm.
right into Figma, and of course concerns of like where this is this going, what's going to happen to the market. It all started to rise, and I think it was it a press release? I might be wrong, but there was an interesting vision of these advancements of AI. For instance, in this specific scenario,
Hmm.
to Figma, were supposed to raise the ceiling of what a designer using that tool would be able to achieve, while at the same time lowering the floor of entrance, in a sense, to new designers being able to create meaningful things. So at the same time, it's like empowering people with a lot of experience into making more, and allowing easy access for people that do not have that experience. uh, that seems to be a very optimistic, Eddie,
Yep.
vision
Yep.
of AI in the future. That brings the question: would you be optimistic or pessimistic about AI in the future?
I mean, I think our news cycle is this is a huge issue right now. I've had AI governance startups reach out to me in the last 2 weeks. We are at a turning point on this, right? So it largely depends on how we handle it. Um, you know, are we moving towards, peaceful existence and all that sort of stuff? Let's hope so, right? But we also have AI driven, drones, and the guy who did Oculus Rift that, Meta bought years ago now is a military contract. I have a lot of ambivalence, and I'm also excited. I have very mixed feelings about it for sure. It's impressive, that's for sure, but I think we have to be very careful with it as well.
Same. I don't think anyone can pinpoint how it's going to be good or bad. It's probably going to be both, right? Uh, but one interesting thing that is starting to happen recently is the marketing. It's heating up a little bit, and it's starting to get competitive, right? Super competitive. For instance, the Chinese AIs,
Hmm.
DeepSeek,
Yep.
newer models coming up. Uh, do you fear that this competitiveness is going to throw caution out of the window, in a sense, meaning that everyone's going to try and get the next thing without thinking too much about security or how reliable is this?
Yeah, I think we are. I think we've already taken a lot of risks. I mean, I think caution has been thrown out to a certain extent, right? And there's what's publicly known about AI, and I mean, at least in the United States, we have a long history of the best tech in the world is classified, right? So is there better stuff out there? Possibly, probably. Are there, military connections or government connections with a lot of these big tech companies? There always have been, right? So I mean, the question is, are we in an arms race with China, or, the US and China, and where does Brazil and other countries fall into that? Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lack of caution right now, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like any other sort of huge advancement, right? Like nuclear weaponry, right? I mean, are you gonna pump the brakes? Well, not if the other guy isn't, right? I can't,
Yep,
so yeah, those are tough things to think about, more philosophical for sure.
definitely. Philosophical. Let's imagine our businesses then. How do you think marketing and sales evolves with AI? Or let's not even go with it. I mean, it's probably hard to not imagine the next steps as being related to
Uh-huh.
artificial intelligence. But
Yep.
where do you see sales and marketing going?
I get pitched, probably sometimes high volume day, I get 10 meeting setter pitches. Hi, I'm so and so, you know, I want to use AI or bots or whatever, to set meetings for you. And then you can, have clients. Is the Obviously at the end of the day, it's supposed to make me and anybody who uses meetings make more money and that sort of thing. And a lot of them are clearly bots, right? And some of them even brag about it. Like, there's a young guy that reached out this week that said, hey, I bet you didn't realize that was a bot. I'm like, yeah, I actually did think it was a bot. And well, he goes, well, wasn't it a lot better? And I was like, well, actually, it's kind of on par with about 20% of what I get. And yes, there's worse. But fundamentally, if we were to sort of zoom out on what you do and what I do, I'm not really interested in working on commodity anything, right? Like you guys are very pro. The people that use you want their clients to have an amazing experience, right? I mean, it's the same thing on my side, right? We just work different parts of, we work top to middle, and the sales part, we're not a UX firm, but it's the same thing, right? I mean, a premium experience, right? And people are willing to pay for premium. So the question for me with AI is, am I using it as the client? Am I aware that the vendor is using AI? And does that make me feel like they care more about me and the experience and my time? Or does it actually make me think they don't care about me at all? And I think people are getting that really confused, right? So there has been, we've talked about banks and credit unions, right? I had a 20-year bank relationship that I finally just gave up on them because they struggled so much with technology. But they also outsourced their human support overseas, right? And they didn't invest in training those folks. And there's bizarre IT problems where those folks had better access to systems than the US people. So it's this mishmash mess. So in their scenario, if they, routed my calls when you block my credit card for some bizarre reason when I'm buying gas, a mile from my house, and that went to AI and they resolved it immediately, that would be infinitely better than sending it to the Philippines to a call center for them to, take 30 minutes to figure out what the problem is, right? So would my perception be that the bank cares more? Yeah, they gave me back my time. Fundamentally, you're wasting my time, right? So in that scenario, it's better, right? There are also scenarios I've had the pitch probably 5 times in the last year of, would I like to digitize myself? And if I did, would I basically do the same thing as a bot and, a LinkedIn bot that sends cold outreach, but have it be a video, right? So would I like to send someone an AI video of myself to convince them to do business with me? And my response to them was, I do think there are interesting cases for AI, right? And animated AI, uncanny valley. I'm sure you know what that is. And
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not sure these don't pass that, aren't in that arena in the first place. But the real question is, if we're working on high dollar agreements where, I mean, you and I fundamentally do the same thing, right? I mean, we are a layer between a good or great product or service and clients. And what needs to pass through that layer is money, fundamentally, right? Is AI being used in a way that makes that increases trust? And I would argue that a lot of the people are chasing these plays that actually it really decreases trust, right? So what does it mean to me? So people used to use this product called Vidyard, right? It's probably still around, but fundamentally it would allow you to embed a video in a LinkedIn outreach or an email. And so instead of a just pure text based, you're supposed to watch the video. So this is sort of a replacement of that, right? Except instead of a human recording themselves and saying something either generic and pretending it's not, or they actually recorded like, hey, Andre, I did this research and blah, blah, blah. And here I am. It's an AI version of that doing that. So let's say that I receive that. So you want me to do business with you so much that you sent a robot video of yourself that was also researched by a robot and you probably don't know who the hell I am. Like, how is this helping anything? Right. So I mean, my answer with AI and with all of that is, as a research tool, if I show up to a meeting, I mean, a lot of, people tell me this all the time, people bring me really complex sales and marketing challenges, right? Before I ever talk to them, I never take a meeting like in an hour, I won't accept meetings, that fast. But if I'm going to take a meeting, I turn a lot of them down. But if I do, I'm going to do some digging into them, right? And what was their problem and research it, right? So if AI can help me research it and be better prepared, the perception from the other side is I care more, right? That's a great use case. So I love AI as as a research tool for people that can't write well, that have writer's block, that gets them over that. I think that's fantastic. But I've also had, junior salespeople, and where fundamentally the job is talk to this stranger. You have all the data to know that this conversation needs to happen. And they go to Chat GPT instead of writing an email. And I look at the email and I'm like, did you actually read this email? So, it really just comes down to like any tool, are you using it to create a better experience or is it worse? Right. So I can see scenarios where, the Ritz Carlton they have a front desk that's at the front desk. Maybe they have, you've probably seen dystopian, movies where there's AI at the front of a museum and it walks you around, right? So the Ritz Carlton could invest in really good, video based AI and have it on every floor or in every room. That would probably enhance the experience, right? So it really is just very situationally specific. But to me, it's in sales and marketing it's just fundamentally, are you creating more trust and the
Mhm.
perception that you care more, or are you actually lowering it and basically making it crystal clear that you don't care, right? That's
Makes
the
sense.
fundamentals of it today, at least as I see it.
So, Eddie, we've mentioned a bit the human aspect, right? Perhaps the psychological aspect, both of UX, AI. Uh, what are some psychological triggers or patterns that exist in sales and marketing that get people to buy or engage or even to trust a product?
Well, I think the trust is, yeah, trust signals are a big one, right? So there are some patterns that, in my world are used a lot on, they're let's call them LinkedIn influencers that put out that sort of information, right? So some common ones, right, would be, um, do you have a developed social media profile? So if you're a sales executive, especially in B2B, from a trust perspective, you should have a real LinkedIn profile. You should have a headshot. You should have a background. You should have your history, right? Your sort of resume, right? A lot of times, from a trust perspective, especially we're many generations of tech startup and everybody knows, including, and venture capitalists say this, right? Most tech startups fail, period, right? So a lot of times, companies will very quickly look at how many employees you have on LinkedIn as yet another sort of trust signal, right? Trophy logos is, a very common trust signal, right? So, you know, is does this company have any logos as clients that I recognize, right? If you have publicly traded clients, that's very common, right? There's a ton of PR pitch where people will say, "Would you like to be featured on, CNN, whatever, Yahoo News, Yahoo Finance, on and on and on." And a lot of times, that coverage doesn't drive any business value at all, but they can at least take those logos and put in a banner that says as seen on, one, two, three logo right across, right? So those types of grids are trust based. Um, but I think the ones that are really less understood, another one that's really common right now is a founder brand, right? So Nick is, I would say, is a founder brand, right? He is a character in the story, right? I tend to, be a little bit more behind the scenes, right? So, sales funnel professor, there is a professor and I am not him. He is a cartoon. He happens to be an AI, at least the way the story is told, right? Um, so that, but a founder brand, right? There is a book and there are certain companies that, are intricately tied for good or bad to their founder. So that, Tesla, for example, I think got a ton of leverage out of Elon. He's not actually the founder. He bought that company, but, for a minute he was, very popular and people were comparing him to, Thomas Edison, for example, the Thomas Edison of our generation. Now I think a lot of people will not buy a Tesla because of Elon, right? Regardless of how good the engineering is or price or whatever. Um, so that's another one that's sort of common, and you choose, right? But I think some we do a lot of, let's say, software and B2B, right? But I think that if we were to look outside of that and look at, consumer products, right? There are a lot of very expensive consumer products that make no sense in the world, right? Why would you pay this, right? So Coca-Cola sells, I don't know, 30 types of water. It's water. It's everywhere, right? And mostly free. There's a great brand story about these guys that did Liquid Death. It's worth looking up, right? That's a recent brand story. I think it's worth, maybe they crossed $1 billion. I don't know, right? But fundamentally, it's water in a can that looks like a beer can, right? A craft beer can specifically, and that's all it is, right? There are shoes. Golden Goose, right, is a pair of women's shoes that sells for a lot of money, and it looks like it's run over. My point is, from a credibility perspective and psychology perspective, yes, you can do those sorts of things, but you can also tell a really interesting story, right? So creativity, right? I think there are people that do a lot of B2B that would tell you you have to be a founder brand and you must, have those logos, and you need to, do a podcast, for example. And, podcasts can work. Podcasts can be a top of funnel, and they're also great for credibility, right? Because people can get to know you if you want to. But we also have brands where there's not a single human on the website. No one is named. There is no team page, but the writing is so good. It speaks so directly to the pain points and what that audience cares about that it's stronger than that, right? And the way you judge it, at least in my mind, the way you judge how strong a brand is and all those sorts of things from a sales funnel efficiency perspective is it's the number of touches, right? So a lot of work that we do, a client will say, we've done PPC, we've done social media, we have 20,000 followers on this. We have, X amount of BDRs and X amount of SDRs and AEs. And, we use every tech thing under the sun. We have 20 things bolted onto Salesforce, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll say, okay, really cool. Let me ask you this, right? Let's talk inbound. Tell me how many inbound people saw your whatever. Could be a LinkedIn message, could be an organic result on Google, could be a paid ad on Google, could be a social media post, whatever it is, whatever top of funnel. How many strangers saw that once, went to your website, and did exactly what you wanted them to do the first time? So that's the touch one test, right? If you have those touch ones, you've nailed your messaging and you've nailed your branding, right? And it doesn't have to be any of those things, right? You can do that 100% with creativity as a day one or day zero startup if you put in the effort. But fundamentally, what people are resonating with psychologically is, I don't know who these people are, and I don't frankly care because I'm never going to be friends with them, right? Because I don't live where they live, right? I just want what they have. But if I know these people get me, and they put so much care into their writing and how they do this, then I'm going to make a bunch of assumptions about them that they also put that degree of care into what they actually do that they sell, right? So those sorts of, like you said, there are shortcuts, right? People want shortcuts. We want to spot a pattern that we like. The only people that I know, I used to sell software heavily into the accounting industry, and accountants will actually do their own comparative analysis, lay out this product has these features and cost and this, and end up with an awesome analysis, right? But hardly anyone does that, right? And if somebody's window shopping, maybe because they feel compelled to out of abundance of caution, or maybe they were required to by their boss, they don't really want to do that. And however many steps it takes them to get to the one, same thing as dating, right? That's where they want to get, right? They may do lip service to window shopping the rest, but they just want, they already know you're the one, right? So if you have that nailed, they're not going to window shop, right? Or if they do, they're going to just go boop, 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 for, checking the boxes kind of a thing, right? So, I think there are different ways to do it. But at the end of the day, it ends up being trust, right? We as humans can see it. It doesn't have to be a conversation like this to understand whether or not we trust each other, right? It can be a website. It could be a podcast. It could be, something animated, right? But if it's really is so spot on and we know it, then the trust is there, and then the purchase is going to happen.
Eddie, can I say your career has spanned over more than 20 years? Is that an accurate, or do we throw it even higher? What would you say?
Oh man, we're getting close to 25. I had my first internet business in undergrad, so yeah, it's yeah. I am post 40. Scary to think about. I sometimes have to ask my wife how old I am now, but yeah, that's accurate.
In a sense, I one information I did not find about you is how old you were, but I would never go and say, yeah, above 30. So
Hey,
take that as a
I'll
compliment, I
take it.
guess,
All
man.
right, sounds good.
That's a good question, man. I mean, we didn't really mention, but you are a consultant. You had a career that spanned over 25 years now, but you're also a founder, right? So you started your first business back as an undergrad. Is that it?
I did. So a dear friend of mine, I think we talked about AOL and Prodigy early on, but one of my dear friends in high school, his father was a software developer, and they had internet access via dial-up, even I think pre-Prodigy maybe. I also just happened to go to the high school where the guy who did Mind Springs Children went, and he was a speaker in a high school class of mine. So yeah, I'm just by happenstance, nothing like you'd find in a Malcolm Gladwell book or anything like that. But yeah, I did have some experience and was pretty entrepreneurial. And so yeah, my friend and I, we had an online gambling affiliate site. Before anyone knew what SEO was, but basically we were doing SEO, and we also like to gamble online until that sort of became regulated, and then we said, okay, we don't need to do this business anymore. And it was entertaining, it was fun. Um, but yeah, and then by the time I was 25, 26, I had my own real estate company in Costa Rica, and yeah, I've always been entrepreneurial. And even today as a consultant, we incubate products. We're partnered on a few products. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's it's unique that we have the ability to test stuff on my stuff before we put it on clients, right? And have some understanding and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, I mean, I think I share that with you guys, and I know you guys have a number of, yes, you consult, but you also have things you're developing internally, and that's, I mean, it's amazing that we can do that, right? I mean, it used to take so much capital to do software development, right? So, I mean, like I said, we're in an interesting time for being creative, technically, for sure.
That is an interesting aspect. Is we're a UX UI design firm by design, of course, but we also have projects. I mean, we expand. We're looking always to expand, and how can we help people in different ways, and how can we make a living off of it? Right. That is the idea. We want to bring value, and designing designing a product, it's cheaper than developing one. That's what we have tended to see, and therefore we have this very good advantage, which is, hey, we have like this empty canvas. We can test things out, and we can do it for as cheap as possible before we even sink too much money into it, right? Eddie, I'd like to ask you. You've your career spanned over 25 years. You've went from founder to consultant. You've led go to market for SaaS companies, and now I know you have a project where you're essentially getting into education, right? You know a lot. That's very obvious. How do you see that? How is it? How do you feel about like getting that information, getting that knowledge out there?
I mean, I think it's, I'm an introvert, right? So putting stuff out there in general, right, is, an introvert is challenging for an introvert. But I've had the request for quite a while. I've always taught. I actually taught high school when I was 22, and it's just something I've enjoyed. I've always had interns. I've taught junior people. I really like that aspect of it. And then as a consultant, what I've really found is there are just frankly handoff issues, especially in sales funnels. And that's inclusive of, working with UX UI and software development teams, right? Because a lot of products, especially in a PLG scenario, product led growth, or, freemium, or however you want to think about it, um, there are all these handoffs that have to work correctly, right? So fundamentally, what we've seen when I started off as a consultant, um, I did a lot of audits, just audit work, right? As a project, right? It was, hey, you know, we've got this stuff going on. We think we have these problems. Could you just look over this end to end, right? So we've done a ton of that work, and we, very quickly, I mean, within like the first two or three of those, people started saying, "You obviously get this better than anybody we know. Can you help us?" And not we're not displacing people. We're saying, all right, you have these pieces on your team, right? It could be hires, they could be, employees, it could be agencies, and all these people want to help and they want to do the right thing, but it's really about like how do they fit together, right? So that's where the consulting piece sort of grew and grew very quickly. And, I have an amazing wife and two small kids and family and friends, and there's only so much time in the day. And, we've already talked about other projects. So, how do you scale yourself, right? So, people had asked me to do a podcast. That, was certainly a thought. There could be books eventually, but in the short term, what I thought that I could probably do and help people most quickly is to do sort of an e-learning platform, right? So, Sales Funnel Professor intentionally was named that with that possibility in mind. And so we've started developing that. In the present, we'll open that up to early users, hopefully this quarter. But for people that want more of a DIY, they can find a ton of my writing at salesfunnelprofessor.com on the blog. But at the end of the day, there are lots of people that know their piece really well, but maybe there's nobody there to tell them, hey, do your piece this way. Because the handoff from you to you, marketing to sales, or whatever, it really needs to be this, right? And so that overarching sort of strategy, taking the strategy, the go-to-market strategy, right? What is it and what makes sense in the first place? And that's research. A lot of companies don't do research, period, right? But do the research, do it right, and then out of that, decide we can do these things, and we either have the pieces and they're just not executing it right, or we have gaps or whatever, but sort of filling that in, right? So that at the end of the day, you can go take and get certifications on, whatever you want. There's, all kinds of great content out there. You can be certified on Google and HubSpot and most products, that get old enough, you can get certifications. That's not what this is about, right? That's a very point solution, right? This is for CEOs, marketing agencies, founders that need to understand, right? If we zoom out, my sales funnel, unfortunately, is very complex. There's no other way to do it, but it needs to seem very simple and amazing to my clients. What are the pieces, and what does this piece working correctly look like? And if it isn't working correctly, how can we correct that, right? So it's much more about end-to-end funnel development, which at the end of the day, we talk about touch one earlier in the call. The other one is a lot of companies have what's called a showstopper, right? There's one thing in their mix. It could be a person, it could be some sort of communication, it could be, a botched thought, right? Or it's a thought that somebody thought was good, but it really is a massive credibility killer, for example. Um, Getting those showstoppers out, right? So you could have 9 out of 10 things be perfect, but you've also got a showstopper, which means nothing is going to work. It doesn't matter, right? It's like you got a race car, but the fuel has water in it. Sorry, not drivable. Know what I mean? So it's those sorts of things, right? So it's not. I think that agency owners often came up within a corporate track in a certain way, right? Salespeople come from a certain place, right? And just via the nature of when I was doing business in Costa Rica, I was the inbound, right? Because we were at the beach, but we sold to foreigners. So it was all inbound marketing when inbound marketing started. Website, right? That's conversion rate, that's brand, that's education, right? What does that look like? So all these terms came way later, but we were already doing it. And then sales, right? I was selling, properties to people in a country. Many of them were there on their second visit period, right? So it's a massive education. Like it's not just, do I like this house? It's how do I even own property in this country that isn't my own, right? So, those sorts of things, right? So it's much more about tying the pieces together. That's really what the course is about, right? If somebody just wants to, get into the weeds on every single, dial in Google Ads, for example, there are, better courses for that. This is much more about strategy and end-to-end optimization.
Amazing, fascinating, Eddie. That's terms I have personally never heard about, and I think that's fascinating knowledge. A question I have for you: I've asked this one, to be quite honest, in our previous episode to our CEO Nick Venturi,
Okay.
but I think from your perspective, I believe we're going to get an amazing amount of knowledge as well. So throughout your career, uh, I mean, you've mentioned from undergrad b- gambling websites to then real estate in Costa Rica, capital fintech capital of the world, consulting, education. What is one thing that has stayed the same, or one thought, a philosophy? What's something that stayed the same, and what is something that has drastically changed if you compare to the beginning of your career there?
So I think what's the same is, you know, money changes hands based on trust at the end of the day, right? So there are certainly people that will manipulate, right? Manipulative sales is a thing, and some people even brag about it, and that's out there, right? So, but at the end of the day, whether that trust is, you know, should be there or there's somebody missed it and they shouldn't trust it, the deal got done based on trust, right? Somebody thought something was going to happen, and either it did or it didn't. Um, I think that's the same. I think a lot of what has changed is the the volume and speed and ability of smaller and smaller teams to serve wider and wider audiences. A single person's reach, and the whole influencer thing came in much later, right? But a single person who's a non-celebrity, I mean, pseudo celebrity, whatever you want to call it, right, can reach millions of people now, right? That wasn't possible then, right? And a team like yours, you're in Brazil, I'm in Atlanta, we can serve the same client in Singapore, right? It's not a problem. So I mean, I think reach and sort of just the volume, team sizes are getting smaller, but volume of out, like let's call it impact, let's say, can be much greater
Mhm.
now, which is pretty awesome.
That makes sense. Eddie, I like to try something. Could we go for some rapid fire questions?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. These are questions that, well, ideally they're rapid answer, right?
Okay, all right.
And they're gonna be, some of them are stingy, man.
We
Get
got we,
ready.
we got a timer going.
We have a
All
time.
right.
Well, it's a psychological one.
Okay, all right.
Eddie, what's the most underrated skill in sales?
Listening. I mean, it's listening, empathy. I mean, it's not. You don't have to be super articulate. You need to listen and just you need to want to help people, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's about, right?
Worst UX mistake that you see often?
I would say that, oh man, that's a tough one. I'm gonna fudge this answer. There are really two that I see, right? One is it's not cohesive, right? From one screen to the next, to the next, to the next, it's all over the place, right? You do this one way here, you do this some other way here. The other one is just I see a lot of people start something new, but they completely ignore, basic what I would call proofreading things, right? Alignment, right? Spelling, word choice, right? And those are crazy too, because if you spell things wrong or the word choice is off, it has the same impact as crappy navigation or whatever. So I would just say like general lack of proofreading.
Yeah, I see that too often, and as a project manager, that's usually on me if it happens. So we
Okay.
avoid that a
All
lot.
right. All right.
Eddie, a product or service that you love purely because of its UX?
I'm a huge fan of, I mean, I have a stack that I kind of like to use, right? So, I think HubSpot has done an amazing job of tying together a platform in a way that in prior, we talked about generations was multiple apps. So that's a fantastic tool. I use Hotjar a lot as well. Uh, I don't know that WordPress has the greatest UX internally. It's kind of the same that it's always been, but it's so extensible. So that's really amazing. Um, I'm trying to think if there are some other good ones. I'm starting to play with like Mid-Journey and Dolly and some of those, and I think they're fascinating. I don't know if I'm quite there yet on those, but those would be some of my top ones right now.
Makes sense. And if you had to start a business in a completely new industry tomorrow, what would it be?
I'm going completely different. I'm going naturalist tour guide. Imagine 3 days whitewater rafting, Argentina, Chile. I don't know, something like that.
Well, yeah, you got me on board there,
All
man.
right,
That is a
sweet.
good one.
Let's do it.
Eddie, we have a final question. That's usually one that I tend to like writing it in a bit of a more philosophical way. Uh, this one would be: you've built a career helping businesses grow and succeed, but what does success means to you?
I think that what I mean, a lot of it is measured in dollars, millions and tens of millions of dollars in a sales funnel and how fast we can pull that off, right? But really, I think what people want, and this is the same for your firm, if we were to sort of abstract that, is they want a phase change, right? Things right now are a slog, right? We've got incremental growth, or we're actually sliding backwards. We're trying all these things. Things are dysfunctional. People are mad at each other, and we don't know why. And we're getting bombarded with information on, whatever, like clickbait type stuff or low quality stuff. And we've tried it and it's not working. Right. So, having been around a lot of failed startups, I mean, that's, some of those are great products, right? But they thought that the engineering would somehow overcome a lack of understanding of what it is, or things like that, right? But I think it's really, whether it's an existing company or something new, it's a phase change, right? Things are really frustrating, things are really hard, and then now we got it, right? And it's not just one person gets it, the whole organization, things are starting to click, and now it's very optimistic. And now the options are opening up, right? And we have just so many ways we can go, and it becomes a much more creative, world. So if I would say one thing, I mean, it's, we get a lot of referrals just because of, it's a lot of revenue quickly is often the result of what we do. But to abstract from that, I mean, I think it's a phase shift, right? They couldn't change gears, right? Having tried all these things, and they really needed to, and then we did it.
It's fascinating, Eddie. You make me want to start up a company just so I can get and find that kind of professional. Eddie, thank you very much for being here with us today. It was a great pleasure, and I'll see you around.
Andre, thank you so much. Always a pleasure, sir.